With the steering wheel over here on the workbench, looking at the back of it, you can see, as I said, we need to clean this up. We need to clean up down here at the ends of these little wires. But mostly what we need to look at is, you can see all these cracks throughout here. There are a whole series of cracks. The product here originally is a product called Tenite. Tenite was an early plastic created by the Kodak Corporation. And at the time it was really high tech, but what happens here happens after just a few years, that the Tenite becomes a problem. Previously, I'd done enough to this, just putting some epoxy in it to hold it in place. That was PC7, which I don't think is the best for the job. It's going to be better to use what we're going to use, which is a Pore 15 epoxy putty. But what we're going to do is go through everywhere one of these cracks exists. We're going to grind it out so that the crack has a large surface area instead of the small surface area of the crack. And then we're going to fill it with epoxy putty. Alright, here I have a motor tool with a round sort of burr in it. We're going to see how that's going to do. Might not be what I use for the actual work. Alright, that burr seems to work pretty good. What you'll find down here inside is that there is a metal ring about 1/4 inch in diameter, maybe it's 3/8, I'm not measuring it, of course, going all the way around, and that's what the spokes are actually welded to. Any place you've got a crack, in this case it doesn't go all the way around because there's PC7 on the other side, so we'll only go that far, but any place there's a crack you got to go through and grind it out. And I must admit that burr works pretty well, so that's a little round burr, works really good to do this. So I'm going to go around and do all of those, and then we'll be back with you. There's a lot of grinding away to find all the spots where there are cracks that I can find. And we've ground them down to the metal pretty much every single time. Almost all of them are all the way around. There are a couple that actually aren't, and I might find some more little flaws as we go through here, but we'll see. Pretty soon though, we're going to be ready to start putting some putty into this. Well, as you can see, I got a lot of mess here. What I'm working with now is I've switched to a pointed grinding stone, turned the motor tool down, and I'm going through and widening everything out so I got lots of surface area to bond to the plastic. That completes widening them all out. Next thing I'm going to do is take a piece of steel wool and make sure I get all these little burrs off of here. Nothing difficult, just a little piece of steel wool to do that. Then we'll be back and ready to fill with putty. We're just going to go through and get these burrs out real quick where we see them. If we get something a little more stubborn, we can always use a knife or something. And for the last little bit, we'll get a knife and get a few little pieces out of here. Go around with the knife here. Anything else we don't like that we want to get out. Do one side at a time. This isn't about making something pretty right now. It's about making it so that the epoxy will go down in here and stick real well. So we're just taking out loose pieces that would cause air pockets, etc. to form, which we really don't want. That looks pretty good. All right, back with the steering wheel on a slightly cleaned up workbench. We're going to switch to using now the epoxy putty by Pour 15. It's a industrial filler, and it'll work really good for this particular job. Comes in A and B parts, and you want to cut off equal portions of the A and equal portion of the B, obviously using a knife or something similar that you can cut through it and get you equal portions. You're going to knead them together, and we're going to put them in the openings we made. All right, we have equal portions of the two components. Comes wrapped in plastic. Besides the plastic outer casing, you want to take the plastic off, obviously. And we're going to knead these two together until they're one uniform color. Twisting helps, as well as obviously squeezing. And just twist and squeeze and twist and squeeze until you get it all kneaded together as one color. It has a 30-minute work time once it's mixed up. Claims it sets in about an hour. I'm actually going to leave it overnight so that it's thoroughly set, ready to sand or contour any way I need to. I'll show you various ways we might do that. As I said, keep twisting and squeezing. They suggest using gloves, but I gotta tell you, if I use gloves, I think this stuff would just stick to the gloves, so I'm not using gloves. Although I must admit, some people can be very allergic to epoxy. So I can't say what your situation will be. I just know I can get away with it. Even though it's sticky, it seems to me like the only practical way to do this. As I said, I think the gloves would stick to it something terrible. So I'm going through and kneading it, and as you're seeing, it's becoming one color. I'm not getting two colors when I pull it apart anymore. So we're pretty much getting it the way it's supposed to be. Comes out sort of a gray shade. If you look at the original here, it's a little darker. There's a couple of spots I do see that still need to be mixed. So it'll come out a little darker than the white side of it. In some ways, I wish it were obviously darker yet, because it'd make it a little easier to tell it's thoroughly mixed. You can tell the different colors, but it'd be nice if it would mix up just a little bit different color than it does. However, I think we got a good mixed epoxy. I can feel it starting to get warm. And the goal here is to get thoroughly pressed down in that each one of these depressions. Now you got to remember, the top of the steering wheel is round, the bottom has finger holds. So you're going to have to do some contouring here and there to get it to work out. You see I've got a gap in there and I don't want a gap. Add more material. This is one of those cases where it's better to have too much than not enough. Too much can be removed. Not enough is going to cause you the trouble of having to try to go back and add on it, and you don't really want to add small parts of this. I honestly don't believe you'll end up as strong as if you get it right the first time. So it's better to get the stuff thoroughly pressed in here. Flip it over as necessary. And remember, the rear has the depressions for fingers or the raises in between. And you can add your depressions back in pretty easy after the fact. Just make sure you get everything thoroughly filled in. You don't really want to be short on this material. So we're just going to keep going around and filling up each one of these sections, which will take a while, because there are quite a few failure points, as you saw when I went through and cut them out. And your steering wheel is probably the same way if you're doing one like this. And it won't just be a Graham steering wheel, it'll be like this. It'll be any steering wheel from back in the day. The plastic just isn't as good as the plastic today, but this is something that's going to get to be, for a few of you, maybe a political comment. Plastic doesn't last as long as you've been told. It comes apart, largely because the plasticizer comes out of the plastic and it starts to disintegrate. That's really why you have cracks here. So things won't last as long as you're told they're going to last. That's somewhat of a myth, and you can really find that out when you're doing a steering wheel, but lots of other things have the same problem with plastic. So don't expect plastic parts to last for 500 years like some people tell you. Maybe Bakelite if it's not broken, but I haven't seen most of the other plastics last anywhere near the length of time they tell you they're going to last. And that's unfortunate because here we have to fix it. And it'd be nice if it would last a lot longer. Remember, I'm pushing this in real hard into the actual blank areas that we cut out. And remember, too much is better than not enough in this case, as we can take off too much. Again, I think if you put in small amounts of this material, you're going to find it's going to be difficult to impossible to add to and really have the same level of strength you're going to get with the initial addition of the material. So don't be skimpy. Go around and do every single one of these. You'll probably have to mix up more than one batch of putty, but you want to fill them all up. And as I said, I'm going to fill them up and let them sit overnight before I get back at them. You can let them sit longer than that. Stuff's supposed to get very hard, but the goal here, as you noticed, was to get enough surface area to cause everything to bond together real well. If you just had straight sides and it's just a little teeny crack, it's going to probably continue to crack. By doing what we've done, hopefully we've got enough actual surface area that there will not again be any cracking in these areas. All right, here we are the following day, and I've done some sanding initially. You can see the putty has gotten quite hard, and it turns out that we have excess, like I said, you really want to have, because what you ultimately want to do is sand the material down. I'm going to show you one spot that I've actually completed. You can see what it looks like here. If I turn it over, you can see we put the finger contour back in here and rough sanded it. How I'm doing that, 80 grit piece of sandpaper, this old scrap, in a hard block. Also, two different rasps. Got a small one and a large one. The rasp is particularly useful when you're going to put your contour back in for your finger grip on the back, because you can work it around and get everything the way you want to. Right now, I'd recommend the 80 grit sandpaper. And some people will tell you, well, you could power sand this. Yeah, you could. That makes a terrible mess. But more importantly is you're going so fast about it, you may gouge things you don't want to gouge. So even though this is going to take longer, this is a case where I think I'm better off actually doing it by hand. And at this point, as I said, this is very coarse. I'm working on it with 80 grit sandpaper in these rasps, so I'm not really after the idea of it being ultra smooth. I'm after getting the actual base contour back into the shape of the steering wheel. Here we have some really old crummy paste wax. It's not worth anything except for what we're going to use it for. We can take our quadruple aught steel wool here and rub some of it onto this old paste wax, and then we can rub it directly on our part. Just give you an idea, you go through and you just rub it on here, and what ends up happening is it removes years and years of grime and dirt and maybe paint overspray or whatever that's on here, and you'll just take the stuff right off, and you'll end up with a surface that in this case is more than usable. Now if you're going to do a show car, you'd want to totally redo the part and have it replated, but this is going to be a very nice car, and this is something you'd have to lay on the floor to look at. So I'm going to opt for the idea that I can go through and use my quadruple aught steel wool and polish everything up. Now remember, I've got wax on it, and I don't want it anywhere down near where I'm going to paint. So right now we're not going to work in that area. We're only going to work up here in the center. Now we're going to wipe this down real well to get the excess wax off of it, because we don't want the wax to be a problem when we're painting. But as time goes on, we get this thing all done, I can go along and redo all the spokes and make them perfect too. So I'm going to finish that off camera, but that shows you kind of what I'm going to do. When I'm done with it, I'm going to just buff it out with a microfiber towel. The other thing I am using here is a fiberglass pen, and that's just to get down here in the grooves in the steering wheel components, going around doing that. And if you don't push too hard, this will just take off the stuff and won't even damage your plating. So you just go around and work your way around with that too. So when you're done, everything's going to look really nice, and we're not going to spend any money on replating this part because it's really nice enough to use on a decent restored car. Not going to be Concours quality, but it's going to be real nice. And we won't have spent a bunch of money on it. Fiberglass pen, I think, set me back $7.95, and you can get refills for them. So it doesn't really cost very much once you have the pen in hand. And you see I'm just going around, only using it in these grooves because it's a little hard to get the steel wool down in there, but the fiberglass pen works real good for that. The negative with the fiberglass pen is you don't want to get the glass fibers on yourself because they can hurt pretty good if they embed in your skin, and they're very hard to get out. Basically have to grow out. So you want to kind of avoid getting those in your skin. And if you have to get the stuff off of here, you want to blow it away from yourself so you don't get it in your eyes, for example. That would be really bad. But fiberglass pen works really good for that. So we got the grooves cleaned out. Alright, here we have the steering wheel after being dismounted from the spinner. Left all the masking in place, wet sanded it, a little cake pan, and our sandpaper with a soft foam center. That was done with 320, towel to clean up all the time. I went through and sanded the whole thing out. Found a couple minor imperfections that I filled with body filler, and they're very minor, and they've been done sanded out. So what we've got here is a steering wheel infinitely smoother, not good enough by any means. And we're going to put it through another round of our epoxy primer. And we'll show you what we used for primer. It's not necessary to use this particular one, but I wouldn't use a lacquer-based primer for this. In this case, I'm using MP170 right here by Omni Primer by PPG, and it has a epoxy catalyst, MP175 by Omni also. Now, the advantage of using that is it's not going to shrink up by like a lacquer primer would. That's why you really shouldn't use a lacquer style primer for this. There's enough going on with shrinking, stretching, etc., changing in size of the plastic, so let's not add to it a lacquer primer. So we're not going to use that all. We're going to put another coat of MP170 on here. Now, MP170 can also be used effectively as a sealer. So if you were done with something, you could use as a sealer, but we are just going to use it for our primer because we happen to have it, and it works good. Here we have our painted steering wheel. You know, we could go on and give it one more coat since we've done a little cleanup on it, if that was going to be our finished color, and that's actually our base color. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to marbleize this wheel. That will be our next step. But something to keep in mind with your marbleizing or whatever you're doing, make sure your various paints are compatible so you don't get problems between them. Also make sure you're in your recoat window. We're in about 4 hours. We could recoat this with the paint we used on it. But right now we're going to work on mixing up a marbleized paint addition that we're going to use. This particular one on a sample I did yesterday is about the color we're going to shoot at. And we're going to show you the technique of how we're going to apply that. Once that's applied, then the steering wheel is going to get cleared and be finished that way. Looking closely at this right here, you can see this is the color we're shooting for. This is our base color, which is pretty much orange. It's just too orange. It needs to be sort of a brownish orange, and that's what we mixed up. So we're going to mix it up today, and we're actually going to apply it to the wheel. What we're going to work with here is a base coat orange that we got, and we're going to mix in some gray in order to get the color that we want. You can see how bright the orange is. That's going to be too bright for the application. But we'll take the two colors, gray and orange, mix them together, and we should come up with something quite usable. You can see that's sort of a gray. That's what we did in our sample. That is what we're going to do right now. Got to wear gloves for this because I want to put paint on everything. We're just going to use a little cap off of a can of all things brake cleaner. Save those, and we'll use that as our little mixing cup. Combine the two colors, and I'm going to mess around with them on my piece of aluminum here as a palette to find out I've got the right color. Now the other thing we're going to add is we're going to add very slow reducer to this so that this is going to stay liquid extra time for the application, and we'll show you how we do that. I'll put some of our orange in with a old spoon I keep out here in the garage. Predominantly orange, obviously. Then we're going to have to clean off our spoon, and then we'll put in our gray. Now that the spoon's clean, we're going to add a little gray to this. And since we don't know exactly how much to add, because I just mixed it by hand yesterday, we're going to do the same thing today until we get the color we want. That wasn't enough, so we'll add a little more. This is just a by eye mix that I'm doing, trying to get the shade that I found that looked best. And it's improving. You can't see down the cup, and it'd be impossible to hold it up because it will spill. And it isn't worth the effort to try to look down on this. So we're going to mix this up until we get the right color. And we'll start testing our color on our aluminum here in a minute. You notice I'm using a cotton swab of all things to mix with, but that works really well. And if you got to clean up, and these towels aren't worth anything, we just use a little lacquer thinner on a paper towel. Alright, let's see how this color looks. Still a little too orange. Significantly improved, but too orange. So we're going to add a bunch more gray, and we'll try it again. That shifted the color again. But it's still too orange, so we're going to add more. Whenever you're mixing up something like this and you're just doing it by eye, it's always better to not add enough than it is to overdo it. Now we're starting to get in the range of what I want to see. That's pretty darn close. I think I'll add just a teensy more, and we're going to call it good. Now before I get into actually putting this on, I'm going to clean up the spoon again and clean up the area to work with. All right, you'll notice in here I've cleaned up a workspace, got rid of the green and the blue and my samples because we're going to need this to work on. We're also going to add slow dry urethane reducer by Advantage to our mixture here. That's going to slow everything up for when we're applying it, because it's going to dry fast enough when we're actually putting it on. So we'll put that in and also thin it down, obviously. And we're going to mix that in. The slow dry that we're using has a high amount of xylene as well as other components in it to slow the paint way down instead of instantly hardening on us. Next up is the technique for actually putting it onto our steering wheel. All right, here we have the wheel basically marbleized. And the fact of the matter is we have a little camera problem there, so we didn't get to show you a bunch of it. The way it's accomplished is with saran wrap or other plastic wrap. You dip it in the paint after it's been folded up, daub some of it off, and there's a couple spots on here I haven't finished, and you daub it in place. And because of using the saran wrap, and it loads different because it's all crinkled, you'll get differing amounts applied throughout your application, and you'll get a nice marbleized effect, which probably doesn't show well in this shot, but when we shoot it for the clear, I think you'll see how beautiful this actually looks and produces the effect we're after to match the plastic in the combination coupe. And if you haven't seen that, watch the combination coupe video and you can actually see what the plastic looks like and how we're matching that with this process. Keep in mind, whatever you're using for your marbleizing, paint, again, has to be compatible with the paint below it. Really, you do want a daub, and I can't tell you anything better than aluminum to use. I did use slow reducer, but it's still very fast to dry because we're just patting it on here. And by using this piece of plastic that way, we get differing thicknesses of paint, so it looks like not just one solid color. You get multiple colors here, so it looks really good. Quite see that the match here is absolutely fantastic. It's probably more of a lighting trick, but when you're here in person, this matches the dash nigh on perfectly. We've got the steering wheel set in the car. Now right now it's been 24 hours, not even 24 hours quite, since this has been sprayed, more like 12 with the final clear. So I'm going to let this sit and not actually touch the steering wheel. I've only been touching the spider and the center here and working that way to take all the masking off and set it in the car. Now I'm actually going to hook everything up here in the reverse order that it needs to be done to put it back in the car, but I'm going to let this sit for quite a number of days before I'm even going to basically touch and use it. The reason being is you really want this to have dried thoroughly and gotten all the solvents out of it. Even though it doesn't smell highly full of solvents right now, I just wouldn't rate it as something you want to touch at the moment. When I had the tape on here, I had squeezed on it. It seems thoroughly hard, but I would still wait just to make sure.